Hey there. Thanks for joining me tonight. I've got a story that's been sitting heavy on my mind, one I haven't shared with many. It's called The House on Cedar Lane, and it's about a guy who thought he'd found a fresh start in a quiet suburb, only to stumble into something dark. Strange noises, an unsettling neighbor, and a house that seemed to hold its own secrets. It all spiraled into a nightmare he couldn't shake. Stick with me because this one starts slow, but builds into something you won't forget. Let's dive in. This all went down in the spring of 2023. I just turned 29 and moved to a small rental house in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. The place was on Cedar Lane, a sleepy street in a neighborhood called Willow Creek, all tidy lawns and cookie-cutter homes. I'd been bouncing between apartments for years, scraping by as a freelance graphic designer, and after a rough couple of months burnout, a string of bad clients, and a falling out with my brother, I wanted somewhere stable. The house was a steel, a one-story ranch with faded blue siding, a sagging front porch, and a backyard that backed up to a thin strip of woods. It wasn't much, but it was mine at least for the year-long lease. The landlord, a gruff guy named Ed, handed me the keys and muttered something about keeping the grass mowed, then peeled out in his pickup like he couldn't wait to leave. I spent the first week unpacking, arranging my desk by the living room window, and trying to make the place feel like home. The house had quirks, creaky floorboards, a faucet that dripped no matter how tight I turned it, and a faint musty smell that lingered in the hallway. But it was quiet, and after the chaos of city living, I welcomed the silence. The neighborhood was mostly families and retirees, people who waved politely but kept to themselves. I'd see kids riding bikes at dusk, their laughter echoing down the street, and older folks walking dogs that looked as tired as they did. It felt safe, predictable, like the kind of place where nothing ever happened. My first night I sat on the porch with a beer, watching the streetlights flicker on. The air was warm, thick with the scent of fresh-cut grass and blooming lilacs. Across the street, a woman in a cardigan watered her flowers, glancing my way once before heading inside. Next door, a guy in a baseball cap was tinkering with his car, the clink of his wrench carrying in the still evening. Everything seemed normal, almost too perfect, like a scene from a postcard. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed something odd. At the end of the street where Cedar Lane curved into a dead end, a man stood under a streetlight. He was tall, lanky, wearing a dark jacket and a knit cap pulled low. He wasn't walking or smoking or doing anything, just standing there, hands in his pockets, facing my house. I couldn't make out his face, but the way he stood so still sent a prickle down my neck. I told myself he was probably just a neighbor, out for a walk, maybe waiting for someone. But when I glanced back 10 minutes later, he was gone. The next morning, I brushed it off. New place, new nerves, I figured. I dove into work tweaking logos for a picky client, the kind who sends 10 emails a day with just one more change. By evening, I was beat, so I ordered a pizza and crashed on the couch with a movie. Around 9 p.m., I heard a car door slam outside. I peeked through the blinds and saw the guy next door, the one with the car heading inside. His house was a mirror image of mine, down to the peeling paint on the shutters. I hadn't met him yet, but he seemed harmless, maybe a mechanic or a hobbyist. I went back to my movie, but the unease from the night before lingered like a faint hum in the back of my mind. A few days later, I decided to explore the house more thoroughly. The listing had mentioned a basement, but I hadn't checked it out during the walkthrough. The door was in the kitchen, a heavy wooden thing with a rusted knob that stuck when I turned it. I flicked the light switch at the top of the stairs, but nothing happened. Great, I thought, another thing to fix. I grabbed a flashlight from my toolbox and headed down. The stairs groaned under my weight, and the air grew cooler, damp with a smell like wet earth and old cardboard. The basement was unfinished, just concrete walls and a dirt-streaked floor. A few boxes were stacked in one corner, probably left by the previous tenant, and a rusty water heater hummed in another. I swept the flashlight around, half expecting to see cobwebs or a stray mouse, but it was empty, almost too clean. Something about the space felt off, though, like it was too still, like the air was holding its breath. I didn't stay long. I climbed back up, locked the door, and told myself I'd deal with it later. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the basement, the way the darkness seemed to swallow the flashlight's beam. Around midnight I got up for a glass of water and noticed the kitchen light was on. I was sure I'd turned it off. I stood there, glass in hand, staring at the bulb like it was mocking me. Maybe I'd forgotten, I told myself. I'd been distracted, stressed. But as I reached for the switch, I heard a faint creak from the direction of the basement door. My hand froze. The house was old, I knew that. Old houses creak. But this sound was different, slow, deliberate, like someone shifting their weight on the stairs below. I held my breath, waiting for it to happen again. Nothing. Just silence, thick and heavy. I flipped off the light and hurried back to my room, locking the door behind me. Sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning I checked the basement door. It was still locked, the knob as stiff as ever. I laughed it off, blaming my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to focus on work, blasting music through my headphones to drown out the quiet. By afternoon, I'd almost forgotten the night before. I stepped outside to grab the mail and saw the guy from the end of the street again. He was closer this time, standing on the sidewalk a few houses down, staring at my porch. His face was still hidden, but his posture was the same, rigid, unmoving. I raised a hand to wave, hoping to break the tension, but he didn't respond. He just turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. My stomach twisted. I didn't know why, but I felt like he'd been watching me, not the house. I went back inside, locked the front door, and tried to focus on anything else. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was starting to grow. The days after spotting that guy on the sidewalk started to blur together, each one tinged with a low hum of unease that I couldn't shake. I kept busy with work, tweaking designs and dodging client emails, but my focus was fraying. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the street, half expecting to see him again, that tall figure in the dark jacket, standing like a scarecrow under the streetlights. He didn't show up, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like damp clothes. I started closing the blinds as soon as the sun set, something I'd never bothered with before. My neighbor next door, the guy with the car, became a fixture in my daily routine. I'd see him most evenings, hunched over the hood of his sedan, tools scattered on a tarp. He was in his late 40s maybe, with a buzz cut and a faded flannel shirt that looked like it had seen better days. I'd nod or wave when I passed, but he never responded, just kept his eyes on his work. Once I caught him glancing my way as I carried groceries in his stare, lingering a second too long before he turned back to his engine. I told myself he was just private, maybe shy, but the silence was starting to feel deliberate, like he was avoiding me on purpose. One afternoon I decided to break the ice. I was tired of the awkwardness, and part of me wanted to feel like I belonged here, like I wasn't just a stranger in someone else's neighborhood. I grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge and walked over to his driveway. He was wiping grease off a wrench, the air sharp with the smell of oil. "Hey man," I said, holding up a bottle. "Thought you might want one." "I'm Jake, just moved in next door." He looked up, his face blank, like he was sizing me up. For a moment I thought he'd ignore me, but he took the beer, muttered a thanks, and went back to his tools. His voice was low, gravelly, like he didn't use it much. I tried to make small talk, asked about his car, the neighborhood, how long he'd lived here. He answered in grunts or single words, never meeting my eyes. After a few minutes I gave up and headed back, the second beer still in my hand, feeling like an idiot for trying. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the interaction, wondering if I'd come off as pushy or if he just didn't like strangers. Around 1 a.m., I heard a faint clank outside, like metal hitting pavement. I got up, peered through the living room blinds, and saw him in his driveway working on his car under a portable work light. Who fixes a car at 1 in the morning? I watched for a minute, the glow casting long shadows across his yard. He moved slowly, methodically, like he was in no rush. Then he stopped, turned his head, and looked straight at my window. I ducked back, heart-thudding, cursing myself for being so obvious. When I peeked again, he was back to work, like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I noticed something odd while checking my mail. The mailbox, a rusty metal box on a post by the curb, had a small scratch on the side fresh enough that the silver underneath gleamed. It wasn't there before I was sure of it. I ran my finger over it, the edge sharp enough to sting. Probably kids, I thought, or maybe someone's bike clipped it. But the street was quiet, no signs of anyone passing by. I glanced at my neighbor's house. His car was gone, the driveway empty. For some reason, that made me feel better, like the absence of his stare was a small relief. I started paying more attention to the neighborhood, trying to piece together who lived where, who might be watching. The woman across the street, the one with the flowers, was out every morning, watering her garden with a precision that felt almost obsessive. She'd smile if I waved, but her eyes never seemed to match the gesture, like she was performing for someone. A couple of houses down, an older guy with a gray beard walked his dog every evening, always taking the same route, pausing at the corner where I'd seen the man in the jacket. Once I thought I saw them exchange a glance, but it was too quick to be sure. I was starting to see patterns where there might have been none, my mind spinning from too many late nights and too little sleep. A week later, I got a package delivered, a new external hard drive for work. The box was sitting on my porch when I got home, but it was torn open, the edges ragged like someone had clawed at it. The drive was still inside, untouched, but the violation made my skin crawl. I checked the front door, the windows, everything was locked, no signs of tampering. I called the delivery company, but they swore the package was fine when it left the truck. I didn't push it. I didn't want to sound paranoid. But I started checking the locks twice before bed, sometimes 3 times, my fingers lingering on the deadbolt like it could keep the world out. One evening, I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. I headed down Cedar Lane past the dead end, where a narrow path led into the woods. I hadn't explored it before, but something about the quiet pulled me in. The trees were dense, their branches knitting together overhead, blocking out the last of the light. The path was overgrown, littered with pine needles and broken twigs. I walked maybe a quarter mile before I stopped. There, half hidden in the underbrush, was a small clearing, with a pile of stones arranged in a rough circle. It looked deliberate, like someone had placed them there, but the moss and dirt suggested it had been untouched for years. I don't know why, but standing there made my chest tight, like I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see. I turned back, the crunch of my footsteps louder than I liked. When I got home, my neighbor was outside again, leaning against his porch railing, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. He didn't look at me, but I felt his attention like a weight pressing down. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I dreamed of the clearing, the stones glowing faintly under a moonless sky. I woke up sweating, the clock reading 2:47 a.m. The house was silent, but the silence felt wrong, like it was waiting for something to break it. I got up, checked the locks again, and sat on the couch with the lights on, staring at the basement door until morning. I started keeping a notebook after that, jotting down anything that felt off. Times I saw my neighbor, scratches on the mailbox, that torn package. It wasn't much, just a way to make sense of the unease that had settled into my bones. Work was suffering. I missed a deadline for the first time in years, my inbox piling up with annoyed emails. I'd stare at my screen, the cursor blinking like an accusation, but all I could think about was the house, the street, the way everything felt just slightly wrong. One night I was up late trying to salvage a project when I heard a low scraping sound like something dragging across wood. It came from the kitchen, faint but unmistakable. I froze my fingers, hovering over the keyboard. The clock on my laptop read 1:32 a.m. I waited, straining to hear it again. Nothing. Just the hum of the fridge and the distant chirp of crickets outside. I told myself it was the house settling, but my pulse was racing a steady thump in my ears. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and crept toward the kitchen. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp filtering through the blinds. I swept the beam across the counter, the sink, the floor. Everything was in place. But then I noticed the basement door. It was closed, locked, but there was a faint smudge on the knob, like someone had touched it with dirty hands. I hadn't been down there since that first day, hadn't even opened the door. I reached out my fingers, trembling, and wiped the smudge with my sleeve. It came off easily, leaving a faint streak of gray. Dust, maybe. Or something else. I backed away, the flashlight shaking in my grip. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, the TV on low, some late-night infomercial droning in the background. Every creak, every gust of wind made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I heard another sound, a single sharp tap, like a knuckle against glass. It came from the back door, the one leading to the yard. I grabbed a kitchen knife, the blade dull but heavy in my hand, and approached the door. The blinds were drawn, but I could see a faint shadow moving across them, slow and deliberate. My mouth went dry. I dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher about a possible intruder. She told me to stay calm, that officers were on their way. I crouched by the couch, knife in one hand, phone in the other, watching the shadow. It lingered for a moment, then vanished. The police arrived 15 minutes later, 2 officers with flashlights and bored expressions. I let them in, explained the noises, the shadow, the smudge on the knob. One of them, a stocky guy with a mustache, checked the backyard, while the other took my statement. The backyard was empty, the gate locked, no footprints in the grass. The officer came back, shrugging. Could have been a cat, he said, like he'd said it 100 times before. I showed them the basement door, the smudge now gone, and they just nodded, promising to file a report. They were gone in 10 minutes, leaving me standing in the doorway, the night air cold against my skin. The next morning I bought a cheap security camera online, one of those battery-powered ones you can stick to a wall. I set it up outside, angled to catch the back door and part of the yard. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I needed something to prove I wasn't losing it. Work was a mess. I spent half the day refreshing the camera app, watching grainy footage of leaves blowing across the grass. Nothing happened. But the notebook kept growing. Times, dates, little details that felt important, but didn't add up to anything. A few nights later, I was in the shower when I heard it again, 3 sharp taps this time from the front door. I turned off the water, the sudden silence deafening. I wrapped a towel around myself and grabbed the knife, my wet feet slipping on the tile. The living room was dark, the blinds closed. I checked the camera feed on my phone. The porch was empty, the street quiet. But as I watched, the motion sensor triggered, and the camera caught a flicker of movement, just a shadow gone before I could make it out. I stood there, dripping water onto the floor, the knife useless in my hand. I didn't call the police. What was the point? They'd just tell me it was nothing. I started avoiding the house as much as I could. I'd work at a coffee shop downtown, nursing a latte for hours, anything to delay going back. One afternoon, I ran into the woman across the street at the grocery store. She was in the produce aisle inspecting apples with the same intensity she gave her flowers. I said hi, forcing a smile. She looked surprised, then smiled back, her eyes darting to the side. "Settling in, okay?" she asked, her voice too bright. I nodded, mentioned the house was fine, just old. She hesitated, then said, "It's a quiet street. People keep to themselves." Something about the way she said it felt like a warning, But before I could ask, she grabbed her cart and walked away. That night I checked the camera footage before bed. At 2:17 a.m., the motion sensor had triggered again. The video showed the backyard, the gate slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. I rewound it frame by frame. There in the corner of the shot was a figure, just a silhouette, standing at the edge of the woods. It didn't move, didn't approach. It just stood there watching the house. I played it again, my hands shaking. The figure was gone in the next frame, like it had never been there. I locked every door, checked every window, and sat up until dawn, the knife on the coffee table, the notebook open beside it. The camera footage became an obsession. I'd check it first thing in the morning, last thing at night sometimes, in the middle of a work call, muting my mic to scroll through the app. Most of it was useless squirrels whined the neighbor's cat slinking across the yard. But that one clip, the silhouette at 2:17 a.m., played on a loop in my mind. I saved it to my phone, zoomed in until the pixels blurred, trying to make out a face, a detail, anything. It was just a shadow, tall and thin, but the way it stood so still felt like a message I couldn't read. I decided to talk to Ed, the landlord. Maybe he knew something about the house, the previous tenant, anything that could explain what was happening. I called him on a Tuesday morning, catching him between jobs. His voice was gruff, distracted, like he was driving. I mentioned the noises, the camera footage, keeping it vague to avoid sounding unhinged. He laughed, a short barking sound. Old houses, kid. They got character, probably just pipes or raccoons. I pressed him about the last tenant, if they'd ever complained about anything weird. He went quiet for a second, then said, "Guy, before you was fine. Moved out for a job. That's all I got." He hung up before I could ask more. I didn't buy it. Ed's dodge felt too quick, like he was brushing me off. I started digging online, searching for anything about the house or Cedar Lane. The address pulled up a few old real estate listings, all describing the place as cozy and well-maintained, which was a stretch. I found a local forum where people griped about neighborhood issues, speeding cars, noisy kids, but nothing about my street. Then, buried in a thread about crime, someone mentioned a break-in a few years back, a house near the woods where nothing was stolen, but the locks were jimmied. The description was vague, but it was close enough to make my stomach twist. I bookmarked it, added it to the notebook. One evening I was mowing the lawn, the hum of the engine drowning out the world, when I noticed something in the grass near the fence. I killed the mower and knelt down. It was a cigarette butt, fresh, the filter still white. I didn't smoke, hadn't had anyone over. I picked it up with a tissue, feeling ridiculous, but careful, and dropped it into a Ziploc bag. My neighbor smoked. I'd seen him with a cigarette on his porch. But this was in my yard, a good 20 feet from his property. I glanced at his house. His car was there, the hood up, but he was nowhere in sight. I shoved the bag in my pocket and finished mowing, my hands sweaty on the handle. That night I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about the cigarette, the footage, Ed's weird pause on the phone. I decided to check the basement again, something I'd been avoiding. I grabbed a new bulb from the hardware store, a screwdriver, and my flashlight. The door creaked as I opened it, the air cool and heavy. I swapped out the bulb, the new one flickering to life, casting harsh shadows across the concrete. I looked around, more thorough this time. The boxes in the corner were still there, sealed with brittle tape. I tore one open, the sound loud in the quiet. Inside were old magazines, yellowed and curling from the early 2000s. Another box had kitchen stuff, mismatched plates, a chipped mug. Nothing unusual, but the fact that they'd been left behind felt wrong, like the last tenant had left in a hurry. Then I saw it scratched into the concrete wall near the water heater, a series of lines like tally marks grouped in fives. There were dozens, maybe 50, etched deep enough to catch the light. I ran my fingers over them, the surface rough under my touch. They could have been anything, someone counting days, tracking something, but they felt deliberate, like a record of something I didn't want to understand. I took a picture, added it to the notebook, and locked the door behind me. The next day, I was at the coffee shop trying to catch up on work when my phone buzzed with a camera alert. It was 3:14 p.m. Broad daylight. I opened the app expecting another false alarm. The footage showed the backyard, the gate closed, the grass still. Then at the edge of the frame, a hand appeared, just a glimpse, gloved, holding something small and metallic. It vanished as quickly as it came, the video cutting off. I rewound it, my heart pounding. The object looked like a key, but it was too blurry to be sure. I checked the locks when I got home. They were fine, untouched, but I couldn't stop picturing that hand, the way it moved so casually, like it belonged there. I started sleeping with the knife under my pillow, a habit that felt absurd but necessary. I'd lie awake listening to the house, the notebook on my nightstand growing thicker with every scribbled detail. One morning I found a small pebble on my porch, smooth and round, placed dead center like it was meant to be seen. I kicked it into the grass, my hands shaking, and checked the camera. Nothing. The motion sensor hadn't triggered. I stood there staring at the street, the houses, the woods, wondering how much longer I could stay. I stopped going out after dark. It wasn't a conscious decision at first, just a habit that formed, like checking the locks or keeping the knife close. I'd make excuses to stay and work, a movie, anything, to avoid stepping into the night where the streetlights seemed too dim, the shadows too deep. The notebook was my anchor, pages filled with timestamps, sketches of the tally marks, even a rough map of Cedar Lane with X's where I'd seen the man in the jacket. I knew I was spiraling, but stopping felt like giving up, like letting whatever was out there win. One afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail, my nerves too raw for surprises. The message was from a woman, her voice clipped but polite. "Hi, this is Linda from Willow Creek Homeowners Association. We've had some complaints about your lawn. Please mow it by the end of the week, or we'll have to issue a fine." I listened to it twice, confused. My lawn was fine. I'd mowed it 2 days ago. I stepped outside to check. The grass was neat, the edges trimmed. I called her back, but the number went straight to a generic voicemail. I left a message explaining I'd already mowed, but no one called back. It was a small thing, but it gnawed at me, another piece that didn't fit. That evening I was cooking dinner, the sizzle of onions filling the kitchen, when the camera app pinged. It was 7:42 p.m., the sky still light. I opened the feed. The backyard was empty, the gate closed, but there on the edge of the frame was a pair of boots, just the tips, standing in the grass near the woods. The video cut off after 10 seconds, no movement, no face. I rewound it, my fork, forgotten on the counter. The boots were black, scuffed like work boots. I checked the footage from earlier that day. Nothing. I didn't know what scared me more, that someone was there, or that the camera only caught their feet. I called the police again, my third time in a month. The same stocky officer showed up, his mustache twitching with impatience. I showed him the footage, the boots, the hand with the key. He watched it, his face blank, then handed my phone back. "Could be a neighbor cutting through," he said. "No crime here." I asked if they could check the woods, maybe talk to people on the street. He sighed like I was asking for the moon. "We'll drive by tonight," he said, already halfway to his car. I watched him leave the cruiser, disappearing around the corner, and felt the house close in around me. I started noticing things inside the house, too. A coffee mug I swore I'd left in the sink was on the counter, dry and clean. The TV remote, always on the couch, was on the kitchen table. Small things easy to dismiss, but they piled up, each one chipping away at my sense of control. I checked the locks so often my fingers ached. The deadbolts click, becoming a ritual. I even taped a piece of thread across the basement door, a trick I'd seen in a movie, to see if it moved. It never did, but I checked it every morning, my breath catching until I saw the thread intact. One night I was up late scrolling through the forum again when I heard a faint hum like a motor running. It was coming from outside, low and steady. I checked the camera, nothing. I grabbed the knife and stepped onto the porch, the air cool and sharp. The sound was louder now, coming from my neighbor's driveway. His car was there, the hood up, a work light, casting a harsh glow. He was bent over the engine, his back to me, but the motor wasn't running. The hum stopped as I stepped closer, like he'd sensed me. He turned his face half-shadowed and stared. I froze, the knife heavy in my pocket. "Everything okay?" I called, my voice thinner than I wanted. He didn't answer, just kept staring, then turned back to his car. I went inside, my hands shaking, and locked the door. The next morning I found another pebble on the porch, this time with a faint red smear like paint or blood. I didn't touch it. I checked the camera, nothing again. I was starting to hate that camera, its useless grainy feed mocking me. I drove to the hardware store and bought a second one, this time for the front porch, angling it to catch the steps. I spent the afternoon installing it, my neighbor watching from his driveway, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He didn't say anything, but his eyes followed me, steady and unblinking. I ignored him, focusing on the screws, the wires, anything but the weight of his gaze. That night I woke up to a sound I couldn't place, a soft, rhythmic thump, like someone tapping a finger against wood. It was 2:53 a.m., the house dark except for the glow of my phone. The sound was coming from the back door. I grabbed the knife, checked the camera. The feed showed a man standing on the porch, his back to the door, wearing a dark jacket and a knit cap. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his shoulders rising and falling like he was breathing hard. I watched, my thumb hovering over 911, as he turned, looked straight at the camera, and raised a hand. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just held it there, palm open, like he was saying, "Stop." Then he stepped out of frame, gone. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the yard was empty, the gate locked. The officer didn't even watch the footage, just told me to get some sleep. I stopped answering my phone unless I knew the number. Friends, clients, even my brother's texts went ignored. I couldn't explain why, but every call felt like a trap, like picking up would invite something into the house. The cameras were my eyes now, their feeds a constant hum in the background of my life. I'd watch them while I ate, while I worked, while I lay in bed, the knife always within reach. The footage from the man on the porch was saved, backed up, burned into my memory. I'd play it over and over, pausing on his hand, the way it hung in the air like he was reaching through the screen. I decided to confront my neighbor. I couldn't keep dodging him, pretending his stares, his late-night tinkering were normal. I waited until evening, when I saw him outside, wiping down his tools with a rag. I walked over, my heart pounding, the knife in my pocket, for no reason I could justify. "Hey," I said, stopping at the edge of his driveway. "Can we talk?" He looked up, his eyes narrow like he'd been expecting me. "What's up?" he said, his voice flat. I mentioned the noises, the man on my porch, the cigarette butt in my yard. I kept it casual, like I was just curious, but my hands were sweating. He listened, nodding slightly, then said, "Didn't see anything." I keep to myself. I asked if he'd noticed anyone strange on the street, maybe the guy in the jacket. He shrugged, tossing the rag onto his tarp. "People come and go. Don't worry about it." He turned back to his car, dismissing me. I stood there, feeling exposed, then walked away, his words echoing in my head. The next day I went back to the basement. I hadn't planned to, but the tally marks were nagging at me, their jagged lines a puzzle I couldn't ignore. I brought a crowbar this time, thinking I'd pry open the rest of the boxes, see if they held anything useful. The bulb flickered as I descended, the air thicker than I remembered, like it was pressing against my skin. I started with the boxes, tearing through tape and cardboard. One was full of clothes, old sweaters, a pair of worn boots, a scarf that smelled faintly of perfume. Another had papers, utility bills, a lease agreement from 5 years ago, the name smudged but starting with a J. I stuffed them into my notebook, my hands shaking with the thrill of finding something, anything. Then I noticed the wall again, the tally marks. They seemed longer, like more had been added since I'd last looked. I counted them, 62 now, up from 50. I told myself I'd miscounted before, but the new marks were fresher, the concrete dust still clinging to the edges. I took another picture, my flash bouncing off the wall. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint click, like a latch releasing. I froze, the crowbar heavy in my hand. The sound came from the far corner where the water heater stood. I approached, my flashlight beam trembling. There behind the heater was a panel in the wall, barely visible, its edges flush with the concrete. I pried it open, the metal, groaning, revealing a narrow crawl space just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Inside was darkness, the air cold and sour. I shone the light in catching glints of something metallic, a chain maybe, or a hook. I didn't go in. I slammed the panel shut, my heart hammering, and ran upstairs, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, the crowbar on the coffee table, the notebook open to the lease agreement. I tried to read the name again, but the ink was too faded. I searched online for the address, cross-referencing the date on the lease. A news article popped up, brief, and buried in an archive, a missing person case from 2018, a man in his 30s, last seen near Willow Creek. No mention of my house, but the timing was too close. I copied the link, added it to the notebook, and checked the cameras. The front porch feed was frozen, stuck on a frame from hours ago. I restarted the app, my fingers clumsy. When it reloaded the backyard, camera showed the gate wide open, swinging in the wind. I grabbed the crowbar and checked the yard. The gate was locked just like I'd left it. I played the footage again. It was gone, no record of the gate moving, no alerts. The next morning, I found a note in my mailbox, folded neatly, no envelope. It was written in block letters, black ink, "Stop looking." I stared at it, the paper trembling in my hand. I checked the cameras, nothing. I called the police, showed them the note. They took it, said they'd file a report, but their eyes said they didn't believe me. I didn't care. I went to the hardware store, bought a padlock for the basement door, and installed it that afternoon, my neighbor watching from his porch, his cigarette glowing in the dusk. The padlock gave me a fleeting sense of control, its weight solid in my hand as I snapped it shut. I checked it every morning, every night, running my fingers over the cold metal like a prayer. But the house didn't feel like mine anymore. It was a stranger's territory, and I was just passing through, waiting for something to break. I stopped working entirely, my inbox a graveyard of unread emails, my clients long gone. The notebook was all I had, its pages curling at the edges, filled with fragments of a story I couldn't piece together. I started hearing things during the day, too, a faint hum like a voice just out of reach coming from the walls. I'd press my ear to the plaster, holding my breath, but it would stop, leaving only the pulse in my ears. I tore through the house, checking vents, pipes, anything that could explain it. Nothing. I even climbed into the attic, a cramped space under the roof, the air thick with dust and insulation. There was nothing up there but a dead bird, its feathers scattered like ash. I left it, the ladder creaking as I climbed down, my hands black with grime. One afternoon I was at the coffee shop, avoiding the house, when I saw the woman from across the street. She was at a table in the corner, reading a newspaper, her fingers stained with ink. I don't know why, but I walked over, my voice shaky, as I asked if she'd seen anything strange on Cedar Lane. She looked up, her smile tight, and said, "Strange how I mentioned the man in the jacket, the note, keeping it vague." Her eyes flickered like she was weighing her words. "It's an old neighborhood," she said. "Lots of history. Best not to dig too deep." She folded her paper and left her coffee untouched. I sat there, her words looping in my head, feeling like I'd been warned, but not told why. That night I was watching the camera feeds when the power cut out. The house went dark, The hum of the fridge silenced the screen's black. I grabbed my phone, its battery at 12%, and turned on the flashlight. The silence was suffocating, like the air had thickened. I checked the breaker box in the kitchen, flipping switches, but nothing worked. I called the power company, got a recording about outages in the area, and hung up. Then I heard a slow, deliberate creak from the basement door. The padlock was still on. I'd checked it an hour ago, but the sound was unmistakable, like the hinges were straining. I grabbed the crowbar, my hands slick with sweat, and stood in front of the door. The creak stopped, replaced by a faint scratching like nails on wood. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My phone buzzed a camera alert, but the app wouldn't load, the screen frozen on a spinning wheel. The power came back an hour later, the lights flickering on the fridge humming to life. I checked the basement door. The padlock was intact, the thread still taped across the frame. I opened the camera app, my fingers trembling. The footage showed the front porch at 1:47 a.m., the street empty, except for a figure standing under the streetlight at the end of Cedar Lane. It was him, the man in the jacket, his face hidden, his hands in his pockets. He didn't move, just stood there for the entire 10-second clip. I checked the backyard feed. The gate was open again, the padlock hanging loose, its shackle bent like it had been pried apart. I ran outside, the crowbar in my hand, and locked the gate, my breath ragged in the cold air. The street was quiet, the houses dark, my neighbor's car gone. I didn't call the police. I knew they'd find nothing, say nothing. Instead, I packed a bag, closed my laptop, the notebook, and drove to a motel 20 minutes away. The room smelled of bleach and stale smoke, but it was safe, anonymous. I spread the notebook out on the bed, flipping through pages of scribbled dates, the missing person article, the lease agreement. I searched the name again, cross-referencing with the form. Another article came up, older, about a house fire in Willow Creek, one street over, in 2017. No casualties, but the tenant vanished, left everything behind. I didn't know if it connected, but I wrote it down, my pen digging into the paper. I stayed at the motel for 2 nights, barely sleeping, the notebook my only company. I kept the cameras on, checking the feeds from my phone. Nothing happened the first night. The second night at 2:03 a.m., the front camera triggered. The footage showed my porch, the door slightly ajar, like it hadn't latched properly. I rewound it, my heart in my throat. A hand appeared, gloved, pushing the door open, then pulling it shut. No one entered, no one left. I checked the locks when I returned the next day. They were fine, but the doorframe had a fresh scratch deep enough to splinter the wood. I added it to the notebook, my hands shaking so bad I could barely write. I couldn't stay at the motel forever. The cost was eating through my savings, and the longer I was away, the more I felt like I was running from something I couldn't escape. I went back to the house on the 3rd day, the notebook clutched in my hand, the crowbar in my bag. The street looked the same, tidy lawns, quiet houses, the woman across the street watering her flowers, like nothing had changed. But the air felt heavier, like the neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. I checked the cameras first. The feeds were clear, no alerts since the hand on the door. I walked through the house, crowbar in hand, checking every room, every corner. The basement door was locked, the padlock untouched, the thread still in place. I didn't open it. I couldn't. The tally marks the crawl space, the note, they were all tied to that door, and I wasn't ready to face what was behind it. I sat at the kitchen table, the notebook open, and read through every page, trying to find a pattern, a clue. The missing person, the fire, the lease agreement, the man in the jacket, they circled each other, but nothing connected, like pieces from different puzzles. That afternoon I saw my neighbor outside, washing his car, the hose spraying arcs of water across the driveway. I watched him through the blinds, his movements slow, deliberate. I'd had enough of his silence, his stares. I grabbed the Ziploc bag with the cigarette butt and marched over, my anger outweighing my fear. "This was in my yard," I said, holding it up. "You know anything about it?" He turned off the hose, his eyes narrowing. "Not mine," he said, his voice low. I pressed him, asked if he'd seen the man in the jacket, if he knew about the note. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the soap on his hands. "You're asking too many questions," he said. "This street's quiet. Keep it that way." He turned back to his car, the conversation over. I walked away, my legs shaky, the bag still in my hand. That night I set up a trap. I taped a new thread across the back door, another across the front, and left a small pile of flour on the porch, thin enough to show footprints. I didn't sleep, just sat in the dark. The crowbar across my lap, the camera feeds open on my phone. At 2:14 a.m., the backyard camera triggered. The footage showed the gate opening, slow and silent, like someone knew how to move without tripping the sensor. A figure stepped into frame, the man in the jacket, his face hidden, his hands gloved. He walked to the back door, paused, and pressed his hand against the glass, leaving a faint smudge. He didn't try the handle, didn't move, just stood there, his breath fogging the glass. Then he backed away, disappearing into the woods. I checked the door. The thread was broken, the flour scattered, a single boot print pressed into it, black scuffed like the ones from before. I called the police, showed them the footage, the print, the note. They took it seriously. This time 2 officers watching the clip in silence. They searched the woods, found nothing, but promised to patrol the street more often. They suggested I move, said it wasn't safe to stay. I didn't need convincing. I packed everything I could carry, clothes, my laptop, the notebook, and left the rest. I broke the lease, forfeited the deposit, and didn't look back. I stayed with a friend downtown. His couch, my bed, the city noise a comfort after the silence of Cedar Lane. A week later I got an email from an unknown address, no subject line. It was a single line. "You left, but I didn't." I deleted it, blocked the sender, but the words stayed carved into my mind. I didn't go back to the house, didn't check the cameras, didn't call Ed. I wanted it gone, all of it. The tally marks, the crawl space, the man in the jacket. But the notebook stayed with me, its pages a reminder I couldn't burn. Sometimes late at night, I'd flip through it, the ink smudged from my hands, and wonder what would have happened if I'd opened that crawl space, if I'd stayed one more night. I don't know who was watching me or why. I don't know what they wanted or what they left behind in that house. All I know is I'm out, and I'm never going back. Thanks for listening, for sticking with me through this. It's not an easy story to tell, but getting it out feels like letting go just a little. Stay safe out there, and maybe check your locks tonight.